In this section, we will talk about teaching about space from an indigenous perspective and daily life in space and spin-offs of space technology. Many First Nations teachings, including those of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people, use the back of a turtle shell as a lunar calendar. Depending on how we measure a lunar month, the moon goes around the Earth approximately every 28 days. This means that in 1 year, 365 days, the moon goes around 13 times, giving us 13 lunar months with 28 days each. We can see these 13 lunar months and the 28 days. Conveniently, if we examine a turtle shell, we'll find the same pattern of numbers of lunar months in a year and days in a lunar month. The moon teachings are based on the 13 grandmother moon teachings, where January is referred to as the spirit moon, February the bear moon, March the sugar moon, April the sucker moon, May the flower moon, June the strawberry moon, July the raspberry moon, August the thimbleberry moon, September the corn moon, October the falling leaves moon, November the freezing moon, December the little spirit moon, and the 13th lunar moon is the blue moon, big spirit moon. This comes from the 13 Grandmother Moon Teachings by Arlene Berry from her series of compiled teachings. You may notice that the names of the moons correlate to what Canada's Indigenous people would be experiencing during those months, whether it is collection of berries, harvesting of corn. All of these names come from both spiritual and agricultural significance in their day-to-day life. The Pimachoanaki is a UNESCO World Heritage Site located in the boreal forest that covers parts of Manitoba and Ontario. And here are a description of their moons based on their spiritual teachings as well as their way of life. There's an amazing story about a little boy named Chakapis, or a Chakapis. This story is the little spirit or little boy in the moon. If you look up in the moon, you can see at times the image of this little boy holding a bucket. And there's a very special story that is carried along by knowledge keepers in the Opaswayak Cree Nation. I'm going to read this story to you. We are told Caius, long ago, that a family attempted to travel through a strong cold winter blizzard. They were in distress and needed to get to a larger camp for assistance. At some point in their journey, they got confused and were lost in the raging storm. The storm raged on for days and the family got weaker and weaker. When the storm finally blew over, only a little boy from the family had survived. All his relatives had perished in the storm, attempting to keep him as warm as possible. There he sat alone on the vast prairie beside his relatives who had perished. At some point, travelers found the boy and took him to the nearest camp, where he was fed, clothed, and comforted as best as was possible. But the little boy was lost in grief. A council was held, and decisions as to where the little boy would go were made. It was decided that a family with no sons could take in the little boy. It so happened that in this particular camp, a family with no sons stepped up and said they would be happy to take the little boy into their family camp. So the little boy went to live among this family. As the days grew colder and the winter drew on, the large camp broke up into smaller family units. The little boy and his new family set out for their own winter camp. Once their journey began, things started changing in the attitude and interaction between the family and their new little charge. The family began to treat the little boy with indifference and downright cruelty. He was given duties no one else wanted to do, and they added duties others were doing prior to his arrival. He was working constantly. At the same time, he noticed that the family wanted nothing to do with him, and they put up a ragged little tent for the boy to sleep in at night. Thus, he was removed from the main shelter. The little boy was expected to do everything that was commanded of him, while being fed very little and being given tattered rags to dress and warm himself in. Thus the little boy found himself cold, hungry, scared, lonely, tired, sad, unwanted, and lost. As the winter dragged on, the little boy got weaker and weaker. One particular howling winter night, he was awoken from his little tent, and he was told that the family needed water. He was sent to the river, where he was to reopen the water hole that had been previously chopped in the ice by him, to fetch 2 pails of water. So out he went into the blowing wind. As the little boy was finishing his job, the storm stopped blowing and the full moon broke through the clouds. So there he was, standing by the water hole, with 2 pails of water, staring at Nokum Tipiskawi, Pisim, the grandmother moon. As he stood there, a deep wave of grief overcame him, and he began to cry. He stood there looking up at the full moon and began to let go of all of his emotions. He told Grandmother Moon how cold, lonely, and hungry he was. He told Grandmother Moon how hurt, scared, and unwanted and unloved he felt. He told her how worthless he felt. As he stood there with his 2 pails of water crying in the cold night, something wondrous happened. As the little boy was releasing all his emotion, Nokum Tipiskawi Pisim was moved by the sincerity, pain, and the tears that were being shed. She decided she could do something, and so Nokum Tipiskawi Pisim lifted the little boy into the sky and set him down on the moon with her. He would forever stand on the moon with his 2 pails of water, looking down unto Nikawi Aski, Mother Earth, and be a reminder to all looking up of how people less fortunate than ourselves should be treated. Thus, when we look into the night sky and see the full moon, we are reminded to think and act kindly towards the weak ones, the sick ones, the helpless ones. We should comfort the hungry, the hurt, the scared, the lonely. We should look up after the homeless, the orphan, the incapacitated, and the lost ones. The little boy was given the name Achak Apisis, the little spirit, which has since been shortened to Chakapis. This beautiful story is one that is carried through generations of indigenous people. It is one that we should carry as well on how to treat people, especially those who are marginalized. I want you to complete these 2 questions as a reflection of the story of Chakapis. We move on to the challenges of space travel. The feeling of weightlessness in space travel affects the human body in several ways. Together, the effects are known as Space Adaptation Syndrome, SAS. The long-term effect of weightlessness in space can cause serious health problems for astronauts. The first is dizziness. About 2/3 of all astronauts experience dizziness, disorientation, and nausea during their first few days in space because they're constantly falling. The important tasks during a space mission, such as spacewalks and linking up with the ISS, often don't take place during the first few days in space. This way, the astronauts have time to adapt to these conditions. The second is puffy face and skinny legs. On Earth, blood and other bodily fluids tend to distribute themselves evenly throughout the body. When astronauts are in orbit, however, these fluids collect in the upper parts of their body. This occurs because of the constant falling towards the Earth. The body experiences when it's in orbit. This causes puffy face, stuffy nose, and headaches. It also causes their legs to become skinnier than their upper bodies, as there is less blood pooled there. Space travel also affects the body's ability to use water properly and can cause dehydration. Bone and muscle loss. Astronauts can lose up to 2% of their bone mass for each month they spend in space. This is because of an apparent weightlessness environment. Their skeletal systems don't have to hold up their bodies. As a result, calcium and phosphorus, which are usually used for this purpose, are excreted instead of being retained in bones. This is not a very big problem on short missions of a week or two. However, astronauts who spend months at a time on the International Space Station have to be monitored carefully. The effect is similar to bone loss condition known as osteoporosis. While in space, muscles also weaken. To counter both bone loss and weakened muscles, astronauts must use a treadmill on board the space station at least 2 hours a day. Apparent weightlessness also causes astronauts to grow taller by 2 centimeters to 4 centimeters while in orbit. This is because gravity does not compress the backbone as much. Some astronauts, typically taller men, experience back pain when their backbones expand. Readapting to Earth takes about as long as the astronaut was in space. Some bone mass is probably lost for good, however. There are hazards in space. While in space, dangerous conditions exist both inside and outside the spacecraft. Astronauts may face hazards that don't exist anywhere on Earth. Radiation, for example. The Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field help to protect us from the sun's radiation. Low Earth orbit is within the magnetic field, so missions there are somewhat protected from radiation, but astronauts can still be exposed to harmful radiation. Shields on the spacecraft provide some protection from harmful radiation. Spacesuits are also specially designed to protect astronauts from radiation during spacewalks. Astronauts on missions outside of the Earth's magnetic field, such as those to the moon or farther, face even greater risks from the sun's radiation. Mission planners must be able to monitor radiation levels and may have to consider canceling missions when radiation levels are too high. If a base on the moon is constructed, it would have to be almost completely shielded against the radiation. Equipment failure is another hazard in space. A spacecraft is an artificial environment that protects astronauts from harsh conditions. This environment is operated by machines and computers. There are usually backup systems in case these fail, but equipment failure can cause life-threatening situations for crew members. If systems fail, there may not be enough air to breathe, food to eat, or water to drink. Environmental system failure. The environmental system provides breathable air for astronauts. This system is critical to their survival. Returning to Earth from a low-orbit mission involves many difficult tasks. If the environmental system were to fail during re-entry, astronauts would not be able to respond quickly or to perform their tasks. Backup systems provide emergency oxygen in case of environmental system failure. The orange suits that astronauts wear during launch and re-entry have built-in survival gear. These suits contain a helmet with communication gear and oxygen, as well as a parachute pack, life raft, and life preserver in case of re-entry emergency. Loss of communication is a serious hazard for space missions. A spacecraft cannot operate without guidance from mission control when it's time for re-entry, and re-entry is controlled by ground computers. During shuttle missions, Mission Control Center updates the crew each morning with a go-home plan. If communication with ground control on Earth is lost, then the craft must return following this plan. Computer failure. Computer failure may result in an inability to control the spacecraft. The space shuttle has 5 computers to control the main engines and other systems. For critical functions, the computers vote to make sure they are making correct decisions. These computers form a backup system to ensure against any system failures. Space junk. Yes, this is a real thing. Human-made satellites may remain in orbit once they are no longer useful, perhaps for hundreds of years. As they deteriorate or collide with other objects, this space technology becomes waste or space junk. Space junk can also be tools or other materials that astronauts accidentally lose as they work in space. For example, in November 2008, an astronaut working on the ISS, or International Space Station, let go of a backpack-sized tool bag. The orbiting tool bag can still be seen in the night sky. Even small items such as nuts and bolts traveling at a few kilometers per second could heavily damage a spacecraft or working satellite. Scientists are trying to determine how to get rid of space junk. In the meantime, space agencies and astronauts are making great efforts to minimize the amount of useless material left in space. Here are some homework questions for you. What is daily living like in space? Well, let's take a look at eating. Many foods and beverages consumed on Earth are not permitted on spacecraft. For example, precautions are made to keep drinks from spilling. Spilled liquid might get into electrical equipment and damage it. Many of the foods astronauts eat are dehydrated, dried out to preserve them. The food then rehydrated, water is added back and heated in microwave ovens. A typical meal could include beef stew, macaroni, and cheese, pears, and a beverage. Many of the freeze-dried foods, like fruits or pasta we eat today, were developed for travel in space. Take a look in your kitchen cabinets and refrigerator. You might be eating meals very similar to those astronauts eat in space. We have a diagram of Chris Hadfield's waffle with maple syrup that he ate on Shrove Tuesday while in the International Space Station. What's sleeping like in space? Astronauts use sleeping bags that are attached to the walls, ceiling, or floor to keep them from floating into other areas. There's no feeling of what is up or down, so sleeping on the ceiling is the same as sleeping on the floor. Many crew members miss the feeling of resting their head on a pillow. The sheets of materials the sleeping bags are made of are not very soft, as they have to be made of fireproof material. What about personal hygiene? Because of the feeling of weightlessness in space, astronauts cannot use water to shower or bathe. Instead, they use rinseless shampoos that were originally developed for hospital patients. Rinseless shampoos are applied and then rubbed off without using water. Astronauts use wipes similar to those used for infants on Earth to clean themselves. In space, everything floats. Special toilets work like vacuums with devices that direct urine and waste into storage containers. Let's end with space technology spin-offs. If countries had never put money into space exploration, would your life be any different? You might be surprised to learn that there are many spin-offs or offshoots of space technology that you encounter in your everyday life, from the barcodes used to manage food at your local grocery store to the cordless power tools in your home. Here we look at a few of those spin-offs. The first is the Canadarm robotic technology. Canada's own Canadarm robotic technology has been used in the design of prosthetic hands to clean up radioactive waste and other toxic materials. The space vision technology that controls robotic movement of the Canadarm has been adapted to minimize the amount of pesticides used when spraying farm crops. Testing is now underway to use the same space robotics to conduct remote robotic surgery called telesurgery. Recently, researchers at the University of Calgary and at McMaster University conducted experimental projects in which the surgeon directed a medical staff from an operating console while conducting robotic surgical operations on patients hundreds of kilometers away in a hospital in North Bay, Ontario. Researchers are adapting space robotic arm technology developed in Canada to create the NeuroArm. This will be a robot that uses miniaturized tools to conduct highly accurate surgeries. You'll be surprised to know that the GPS system, or global positioning systems, were space spin-offs. People commonly use maps and compasses to determine exactly where they are on Earth and to guide them where they want to go. In 1978, space exploration led to the development of the first satellite-based navigation system called a Global Positioning System, or GPS. Originally intended for military use, GPS technology was made available to the general public in the late 1980s. Today, a network of 24 GPS satellites orbit the Earth twice daily. The system is used to determine the latitude and longitude of receivers located anywhere on Earth in any weather condition, any time of day. Blood pressure monitors. Some of the investments in space research and exploration by government, companies, and universities result in technologies that can be used to monitor human health. For example, home blood pressure testing devices provide us with an immediate measure of our blood pressure. This everyday technology is a spin-off of the device created by NASA to measure the blood pressure of astronauts during launches, when they are exposed to powerful forces and vibrations. The portable device is used to monitor blood pressure is called a sphygmometer. Improved consumer goods. Some technologies, such as personal computers, high-tech running shoes, dehydrated foods, water purifiers, were developed for space exploration, but are still available to all today. Other space technologies have been adapted for use in consumer goods that have wider applications. Some examples are personal computers, high-tech running shoes, dehydrated foods, aerodynamic golf balls, and fire-resistant suits for race car drivers. Check your understanding on this section by answering the following questions and complete any LMS activities.